Good morning and welcome everybody to writing comprehensive evaluation reports. When using an RTI or response to intervention approach to specific learning disability determination. We're really pleased on behalf of the Patent MTSS initiative. We're really pleased to have Dr. Timothy Runge, who is professor at Indiana University of Pennsylvania in the psychology department now, training future school psychologists. He's been a patent consultant, a district practitioner, does a ton of work in this area. So we are really excited to welcome Dr. Runge this morning. My name is Erica Caruter. I'm joined by a number of patent consultants. We will be here helping answer questions throughout the morning, posting the link to the materials in the chat. We have Dr. Silke Caparelli out of the West. We have Mrs. Sherry Hartman, Dr. Gina Spicknall-Cook out of the East and Central region. We have Dr. Drew Hunter and Karen Brady joining. So we're very glad you can join us this morning. If you are seeking credit, you must stay for the entire webinar, and at the end we will provide a link to a survey to complete as well as an attendance code. You may also, if you would like to see live transcription, at the bottom of your screen you can see a little CC. Click that and the live transcription feature should be enabled for you. We are recording this session, and without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Runge.
Thank you, Erica, and many thanks to my patent colleagues across the state for this invitation, as well as their participation behind the scenes in terms of making sure that this webinar goes well, and a special thanks to Kelly Kapp, who is one of the administrative assistants in the Harrisburg office, who has been instrumental in making sure that this goes smoothly. So many thanks to all of those who are supportive of this effort. And I want to thank everybody else for being here, taking at least half of your very busy day to join us today to talk about what I view to be a very important topic, and that is the application of response to intervention, or RTI models, to the identification of specific learning disabilities, which, if you're not familiar with it, happens to be the largest disability category under IDEA, and reading disabilities in particular are the largest categorization of SLDs. So this is not a small matter in terms of its impact on large proportions of students across America. And what we wanted to do is to provide you with not only the logic of RTI for SLD determination, but also how that applies to Pennsylvania's evaluation report. And we're going to actually walk through an illustration of an evaluation report that we believe satisfactorily, if not exceeds, the expectations of the evaluation report requirements, while at the same time maintaining the integrity of the RTI logic for SLD determination. So again, thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us today. As Erica has mentioned, I think previously, although I know there are still people that are joining us, please note in the chat is a link to the Google Drive in which you can access the two materials for this workshop. The first is the PowerPoint, the proverbial PowerPoint, which you can read at your leisure or use as scratch paper after today's session. But I think actually more importantly is the sample evaluation report, which is a PDF. And if you can make sure that you have that downloaded minimally, and I know that not all of you maybe have direct access to a printer at this moment, but if you have the ability to print it, that would also be helpful. It's not necessary, it's not required per se, but it might be helpful as we start to dive into the ER, especially if you have a computer with one screen. It's kind of hard to juggle the PDF and the Zoom and the PowerPoint, 3 or maybe even 4 windows if you're multitasking with work-related issues. It's hard to kind of juggle all those windows simultaneously. So again, not required that you have it printed out, but minimally you want to have it downloaded onto your device so that way you can access it when we get to that point. And so again, keep revisiting that chat link if you're just now joining us, because as I understand it, Erica continues to post that. Additionally, as questions come up, I do invite you to please put those in the chat. Please put your questions in the chat. I'm going to do my best to monitor them but I've already solicited the assistance of my patent colleagues across the state to catch any questions that come up that I might have missed, especially if questions come in rapid fire succession and you happen to be the first or second person to list a question. Yours might get pushed up beyond my screen view, and so again, I'm grateful to the help and assistance of my patent colleagues to monitor that. But again, please ask your questions as they come up. There are dedicated times in the materials today at which I will pause and ask questions. But if you've got a question right there in the heat of the moment, please ask it. Don't necessarily wait until I pause for a question, because it is very likely that other people on this webinar have similar or if not identical questions at the exact same time. So don't be shy. I'm happy to field questions as they come up. Then, just as a final reminder, we are recording our session today, and that is to benefit you, but also a reminder for me to make sure that what I say is technically adequate and is responsive to the needs of the field. And I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I'm being genuine in that the work that I'm about to share with you today is not the work exclusively of myself. It's the work collectively of practitioners, patent and IU consultants, researchers, and as we'll see in just a moment, the work of some very dear colleagues that I believe many of you are familiar with over the years. So we believe that this is absolutely essential work that needs to be shared. And consequently, we hope that this recording will be shared with others in the field who maybe are unavailable to join us today. But again, a friendly reminder that this is being recorded. And Erica or others, could you confirm if this is also recording the chat discussions as well? Do we know if that's happening?
I should be able to download the chat, yes.
All right.
Afterwards.
Therefore, be judicious in what you put in the chat. And so we're all going to be focused on moving this field forward. And just as a reminder, not only we're video and audio recording, but also apparently the chat is being archived as well. Okay, we have a jam-packed morning. We go from 8:30 to 11:45 with a high degree of probability that we'll end a few minutes early because some of our patent colleagues have concurrent meetings that start at 11:45. We want to make sure that we're addressing everyone's questions at the end. So it is a little over 3 hours. We, of course, will take a break at some point in the middle of the morning because everybody needs a stretch break. And therefore, you can anticipate a stretch break at some point in the middle of the morning. And without any further ado, I wanted to then dive right into the content. But again, thank you all for joining, and buckle up. It's going to be a fun ride. Additionally, as we go throughout this content, there are opportunities for active engagement. If you know anything about effective teaching practices and what works in terms of helping students, whether they're 3-year-olds or 28 or 50-year-olds, learn anything, is that one of the most powerful impacts on learning is active engagement. In fact, the effect sizes of active engagement, or opportunities to respond is another way of describing that, are some of the most powerful effect sizes we see in the empirical literature. And I am a firm believer in using best practices in K-12 settings, and I do my best to do that in higher education here in my position at IEP, and also in webinars. And therefore, as we will see in just a few moments, I have built in some opportunities for responding. And I implore you to engage in those activities because opportunities to response are known to be some of the most powerful impacts on learning. And if we're trying to move this field forward, in part, in some small way through this webinar, then we must adhere to those evidence-based practices for moving people's skills and competencies forward through active engagement. More on that in just a little bit. All right, finally, we're now going to get into the content. And actually what I must do ethically and legally is just note that everything you're going to hear about today is, I believe, consistent with what patent and IU consultants would embrace. Frankly, a lot of this material has been generated using their input. But I should note that everything that is about to be presented here today is the opinion of myself and some of my research colleagues, and not necessarily that of PDE, patent, IUs, or anybody else in much more important positions of authority here in our Commonwealth. Additionally, I do need to note a financial disclaimer. A considerable proportion of the material that we're about to present, or I'm about to present today, is based off of an upcoming book that I have co-authored with near and dear friends, Joe Kowaleski, Amanda Vanderhayden, Perry Zerkel, and Ed Shapiro, who of course passed away very tragically a few years ago. But it is the collective work of these individuals that will be published in an upcoming book. Publication date is late summer of the current calendar year, and you can see the details about it written here on this slide. But I do need to note that because I'm one of the co-authors, I will receive royalties from the sale of this book. And as I've noted just a few moments ago, portions of the content from today are from that book. And so I just needed to be upfront and transparent in that from an ethical and legal perspective. Okay, getting that out of the way, which is important, but now that we can move on, here's the active engagement element. And for those of you who have used the stamping or annotated feature of Zoom, this is going to be a review for you. If you are new to annotation within Zoom, then here is going to be some direct, explicit instruction that I hope works. And so here we go. If you are on a desktop computer that is using or operating systems that are Windows-based, then you should be able to see images identical to, or at least very, very similar to what I'm about to show you. If you're using a handheld device or you're using Apple or Macintosh software, then I'm not exactly sure how this is going to look. My understanding is it's similar, but not necessarily identical. What I need you to do, and the point of this next exercise, is to get you familiar with how to stamp, so that when it actually matters in a few minutes, when I'm asking you questions that are of substantive value for our workshop, you can actually do the stamping. So right now, this is just direct instruction, getting some practice. And here's the I do component. I'm going to show you how you access stamping, then we're going to do a little we do, and then the rest of this morning, it's all going to be you do. Okay, here we go. If you move your cursor, you're around the Zoom window, probably either at the bottom or the top, you should see an image that appears something like this. And when you do that, I want you to find the image that is of a kindergarten pencil and has the word annotate under it. And when you see that image, I would like you to click on it. Now, if you're not seeing that annotate icon, you might need to go to the, I'm going to go backwards here. You might need to find it under the more options, but you should be able to see annotate. Once you see annotate, click on that. When you click on annotate, then a separate, almost like a drop down or pull down menu will appear underneath it. And it'll have a whole lot of options. Some of them may be identical, perhaps maybe slightly different, but essentially you'll see a bunch of different options. Now, you can pick any one of these, but as I've seen iPhone 2 already do, they figured it out. If you click on the stamp option, then you get yet another set of options. And here is dealer's choice. This is not a projective. This is not a way to figure out what your personality is. This is just simply pick your stamp of choice. And once you've selected your stamp of choice, then you can start stamping all over the screen. Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to do these next couple of steps, but I want to give you the direct instruction now. Please note that your stamps will continue, will persist. They are permanent until you select the clearing option, which is, as we now all are trained or conditioned to know, is illustrated by a garbage can. And once you click on the garbage can option, then you can either clear all of your drawings or clear just your drawings. I'm not sure, you may not have all of these options because you're not in presenter mode or capability. And then lastly, in order to stop stamping, because you'll stamp within Zoom until you click on the red circled X. When you click on the red circled X, then your stamping capabilities will cease to work until you go through these 4 steps again. So again, annotate, then click on stamp, then dealer's choice as to what the stamping option you would like to have. When you're done stamping, make sure to clear your stamp. Don't worry, we have the power here at Patton, or I as presenter have the power to clear everybody's stamps. And then when you want to stop stamping within Zoom, make sure you're clicking on that red circle with a white X in the middle of it. Okay, let's see how good my direct instruction was. That was the I do. Now is going to be the we do. I'd like you to stamp where you physically are at this moment. And I know we have at least one person who's from outside of Pennsylvania because someone logged in as being from Atlanta, Georgia. So if you're from outside the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, then you can indicate in the rectangle at the top. It therefore appears as though we've got some folks that are gaining some acquisition, if not fluency, of using stamping or annotated features within Zoom. And I'll just give it a few more minutes, not minutes, excuse me, a few more moments. We have 65 participants, including myself, and I'm hoping to see a nice representation of those who are participants stamping on our map of Pennsylvania. Okay, maybe just another 15 seconds or so. All right, so far it looks like we've got good representation from the Northeast as well as the Southeast, a little lighter in the central part of the state, and good representation from the West, including my neck of the woods, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and I'm imagining that represents some of my students who have joined us today in lieu of a class that they would otherwise be having with me. Okay, all right, so thank you for doing a little bit of stamp practice. I am going to do my best to clear all the drawings. Again, make sure you've hit that red circle X to stop stamping. And now I got to stop my own stamping. See, I failed to heed my own instruction. Okay, now I got to stamp a little bit more. Again, another practice. We're pretty good on the we do, but here's a little bit more independent practice. Many of us, of course, have been cooped up for, wow, just over 2 years and have not had an opportunity to do a dream vacation. So here's your opportunity to dream. Where would you like to go? If you had unlimited resources, where would you like to go? Florida, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, we're all over Europe. Looks like Mediterranean Sea, the Middle East. Fantastic. We got someone who would love to go to Hawaii. Wonderful. Okay, maybe just another 10 or 15 seconds. Carla's going somewhere in between South America and Africa. I'm imagining there's a tiny island somewhere down there. That's pretty far away. Outstanding. All right. I am going to clear the annotations. You can stop annotating if you'd like, but also we do have another annotation coming up, so you may not want to necessarily stop annotating, because now I want to find out a little bit about who is in our audience. Now we've kind of gone through the acquisition phase. We're going to go a little fluency now and generalization for using stages of learning logic around stamping. I'd like to find out who's in our audience, and I apologize if we have individuals in the audience for whom none of these categories necessarily apply, which is why I've listed an option for others. All right, as was mentioned at the outset from Dr. Karuder, excuse me, I am a trained school psychologist, was a practitioner in Mifflin County School District, which is in IU 11. Shout out to South Central Pennsylvania colleagues. I was a school psychologist there for 8.5 years, as well as a coordinator of special education services for about 6 months. And then I took a position with the Patton-Harrisburg office for 2.5 years. And I have then transitioned to Indiana University of Pennsylvania, where I've been here teaching in a school psych program for the past 13.5 years. Therefore, I am a school psychologist by training and trade, and that is always my love and passion. And now I enjoy the opportunity of training the next generation of school psychologists. It is wonderful to see a large proportion of our attendees identifying as school psychologists, but I also love the fact that we've got speech and language pathologists who are our kindred spirits. And in my practicing years, were some of my closest allies, especially around identification of students with specific learning disabilities in reading, writing, and mathematics, and also autism. And speech and language pathologists have expertise that we need to lean on as school psychologists. Those are just two of the areas in which our speech language pathologist colleagues were immensely helpful in our mission to advocate for students, all students. But it's nice also to see that we have teachers, we have consultants, we have district administrators, we have some parents, and then some folks who are a little bit not sure of what their identities are, but that's okay. It is wonderful to see a wide swath of allied professionals and individuals who are interested in advocating on behalf of children and youth and ensuring that we are able to support the learning needs of all of our students, but in particular for today's session, the identification of specific learning disabilities using RTI, response to intervention logic. Okay, you can stop your annotation again by finding that red circle with an X in it. Oh no, I'm sorry, we still have a few more annotations. I apologize, I forgot to look ahead. A few more annotations, my apologies. So what we will do now is go to the next screen. And what I'd like to do is gauge your familiarity with response to intervention for specific learning disabilities. And we've got a continuum because I anticipate that we have a wide swath of familiarity here in our session today. And so let me give you some guideposts around this continuum. So if you rank all the way to the left, that's going to be, if we're using a Likert scale from 1 to 10, excuse me, Likert scale. The individual's last name is pronounced Likert, and so it is known as a Likert scale. A Likert scale of 1 means you've kind of heard of RTI for SLD, but you're not really sure what it is. A 5 would mean I could, give a good explanation to a non-educator. And then a 10 would be someone who says, you know what, I love reading RTI research while I'm on vacation, or this is my leisure reading because I am so happy to geek out on it. And I appreciate everybody putting in via annotation their level of familiarity here. And I'm going to do some quick math here in a moment after I give everybody about another 10 seconds to respond. Okay, quick math here. It looks like our, of course, we don't have a normal distribution here. We've got a skewed sampling of data, but it looks like our average is approximately 6.23 with a standard deviation of about 1.8, although probably our best indicator would be the mode. In this case, the mode looks to be around about a 6. So it looks as though people could do a fair to middling job of explaining RTI logic using for SLD determination, but we do have some of our attendees who self-reported as being on the lower end, as well as some folks that are probably more akin to me, which is I choose to read RTI literature while on vacation and just smile at my family when they make fun of me for doing that, because I'm okay with that. All right. Thank you all. And so what we're going to do today is I will use this information to kind of gauge how I present the material moving forward. I'm going to kind of hit the middle of the pack, but I am not going to leave those of you who are less familiar with RTI for SLD determination in my wake. That's an opportunity for you to make sure that you ask the questions if you have, if you have them, because I want you to walk away from today being informed and not confused. That would be very poor instruction if you walked away from here being thoroughly confused. Okay, we do have one more annotation before you can stop that annotation, at least for a brief period of time. And that is, if you are building based, I ask you to please self-reflect and self-evaluate where your building is using RTI for SLD determination. If you're not building based, but you consult in multiple buildings, then pick one building. Imagine one building and appraise using that building as your frame of reference. If you are, for example, a graduate student or a parent who isn't necessarily familiar with a specific building, then do the best. Think about maybe a school that you were last in, maybe it was for another activity or another reason, but think about, based upon what you understand, would be that building's familiarity with using RTI for SLD determination. And because I'm a Star Wars geek, the original Star Wars, we'll use our benchmarks of 1 in a galaxy far, far away. We might be doing RTI like 10 years from now. To 5, we're almost there, like blowing up the Death Star, you're almost there. Versus, hey kid, don't get cocky. You might be doing it really well, but there's always room for improvement. All right, it looks like we've got, again, we've got a nice distribution in here. Our distribution seems to be a little bit normal, meaning a bell-shaped curve with a heavier concentration of individuals self-evaluating using RTI for SLD determination as being in the middle, where we're almost there. And I do see in the chat, some folks are saying or clarifying that, and this is true, that I view RTI as being 2 different things, one of which is a service delivery model, meaning we use RTI or MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support logic, to maximally resource instruction and interventions for all kids. So we universally screen, we put kids into tiered interventions based upon their level of need, and we progress monitor throughout those tiered supports. That, in my view, is RTI for service delivery, which is different than RTI for eligibility decision-making. RTI for eligibility decision-making is using that same logic, that same service delivery, but applying it to how we identify students for entitlement services under IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so in my mind, we need to discriminate between the former, which is RTI for service delivery, which a lot of schools are probably 5, 6, 7s, maybe even close to 10s on that, especially elementary schools across the Commonwealth. But when we use RTI for SLD determination, there are probably fewer schools that are using that RTI model or logic specifically for identification purposes under the category of SLD. And again, we have far fewer schools across the Commonwealth that would self-evaluate as a 10 when reflecting upon the extent to which RTI for SLD determination is their primary model for identification purposes. And so thank you to those who have indicated in the chat a reminder that there is this distinction that is very easily lost by many of us, myself included, if we are not clear in the language that we are using. And so as I'm just reflecting on some of the comments that have been put in the post, a fair number of comments are indicative of schools that are using RTI as a service delivery model, which is great, but that is different than using RTI as an eligibility decision-making approach. And today we're talking about the latter, which is how to use RTI for SLD determination, i.e. eligibility decision-making, and then how that is applied to the completion of the evaluation report that is mandated in our Commonwealth for all kids who are evaluated for special education services under the category of SLD. Okay, great. Now you can turn off your annotation. We're not going to need it for a little while. And again, as a reminder, go back to the annotation feature within Zoom. And then once you get to the stamping options, click on that red circle with an X in it, and that will turn off your stamping capabilities for a while until you need them again in a little bit. Okay, as I just got finished summarizing, we're going to talk today about how to use RTI for SLD determination exclusively in our workshop today. and therefore a friendly reminder is warranted. And this reminder is wedded to the special education law that all public schools must follow in the United States. Recall that eligibility for special education actually is a two-pronged approach, meaning in order for a student to be eligible for special education services, the student must fulfill two criteria. The first criteria is that the student must have a disability, and IDEA specifies 13 categories of disability, of which a student must meet one of those in order to meet that first criteria. Got to fit into one of those 13 categories, and yes, those categories can be somewhat confusing and or arbitrary or difficult to operationalize. That is for another workshop. But a student must fulfill the first criterion, which is, do they have one of the 13 disabilities that are codified within IDEA? The second criterion for eligibility under IDEA is that a student must need special education services. If a student has a disability, such as, say, for example, autism, but they don't demonstrate a need for special education services, in other words, they meet criterion A, but not criterion B, then the student cannot be eligible for special education services because they have to meet both criteria. If a student has a specific learning disability and does not need special education services, then that student is equally ineligible for special education services under IDEA because they meet the first criterion, but not the second. This is a critical issue that we must be mindful of when we are considering a student for special education services. They have to have a disability as deemed appropriate by a multidisciplinary evaluation team. And the evaluation team must also conclude that they need special education services. Both criteria have to be met, hence the two-pronged approach for special education eligibility. Our workshop today focuses exclusively on the first criterion. Does the student have a disability? And of course, given the nature and the title of this workshop, we're going to focus on just one of those 13 disability categories, that is specific learning disability. This is a reminder, again, that special education eligibility is a two-pronged approach. And while today we're only focusing on one of those criterion, teams must consider both criteria when evaluating whether or not a student is eligible for special education services. So we talk about the disability categories today with a specific emphasis on specific learning disabilities, or SLD. Within the category of specific learning disability, IDEA specifies 4 criteria. So you got to meet 2 criteria in order to be eligible for special education. That was on the last slide. And then within the category of SLD, there are 4 criteria that must be met in order for an MDT, a multidisciplinary team, to conclude that a student has a specific learning disability. 2 of those criteria are inclusionary, meaning the student has to meet those criteria. The MDT has to say yes to both of those 2 inclusionary criteria. The remaining 2 criteria under SLD are what we refer to as exclusionary. In other words, these are rule outs. The MDT is legally and ethically responsible for ruling out the 3rd and 4th criteria. Now, those 4 criteria are indicated in the visual on the right-hand side of your screen here. And we are not going to spend very much time talking about the 3rd and 4th criteria. Those are the rule outs. We're going to spend at best 5 minutes on those rule outs today. Please do not take the amount of time that I spend reviewing the rule outs as an indication of their relative merit compared to the 2 inclusionary criteria. Under IDEA, all 4 criteria are equally weighted. And therefore, despite me spending little time on the 2 rule outs, Please remember that those two rule outs carry equal weight or equal importance as the two inclusionary criteria, of which I will be spending the bulk of this morning's session reviewing. In short, the two inclusionary criteria are going to be the bulk of what I review in today's session. And those are the two leftmost criteria. And I'm going to drill down into each of these in subsequent slides. But for now, I just need to remind you that SLD determination requires the consideration of four criteria: two inclusionary, two exclusionary, and the vast majority of what I'm about to present today focuses on the two inclusionary. And we need to be mindful that the two exclusionary criteria are equally important, despite the fact that I spend very little time in today's session reviewing them. Therefore, the focus of our session today is on how to operationalize those first two criteria, those two inclusionary criteria, using an RTI model. And by the way, even if a school or a district is using another model to identify SLD, whether it's a model that is akin to ability achievement discrepancy or looking at patterns of cognitive strengths and weaknesses, if you're using those approaches, these four criteria for SLD determination are still required. These four criteria are required regardless of the model that you're using to identify a student as having an SLD. But as I will allude to much later on today, it is my view that many MDTs that use ability achievement discrepancy or pattern of strengths and weaknesses really do not consider the exclusionary criteria, and I submit they are skirting some of the legal and ethical requirements of the first two criteria. I think you're on shaky ground, and therefore I try to make the argument that an RTI model is much more consistent with the four criteria that IDEA requires for all kids who are under consideration for an SLD. Okay, that aside, our focus today is on operationalizing those first two criteria. So that forms the objectives and subsequently the agenda for our session today. First, we want to list and describe contemporary operationalizations of performance, that is the level of reading, math, writing proficiency that a student exhibits. That's the first criterion. We want to list and describe the three contemporary operationalizations of responsiveness to intervention. That just so happens to be the second criterion under the four for SLD determination. We want to explain the logic behind using systematic comprehensive classroom observations for SLD determination, identify the rule outs, and then synthesize all of that into PDE's evaluation report. And therefore, those objectives translate what I hope to be very nicely into the agenda for today. Here is the agenda for our day, and these are somewhat based in chronological order in which they will be reviewed, with one exception. The last agenda that you see listed there is writing a comprehensive evaluation report. That is actually not going to be the last thing we review in today's session. Instead, that writing a comprehensive evaluation report agenda item is going to be woven throughout all of the other agenda items for the day. And therefore, writing a comprehensive evaluation report is not going to be a standalone section of today's session. It's going to be embedded within everything we review. Okay, here we go. Recall, four criteria for SLD determination, and we're going to focus on the two inclusionary. Our first agenda item is centered around this issue of performance level. How well or not well is a student performing in the foundational academic skills of reading, writing, and mathematics, as well as listening, comprehension, and oral expression. More on that in a little bit. This is the language drawn directly from IDEA, which is required of every school that receives federal dollars and thus must follow special education entitlement law. And I have emphasized on purpose what I view to be very critical pieces of the language of IDEA relative to this first criterion for SLD determination. And that is the child does not achieve adequately for their age or grade approved standards. And I underline that state approved grade level standards, because what we're talking about here is, if I've got a student who is in second grade, we know what second graders are supposed to master, right? It's in the academic standards that all educators are required to teach. And then the state assesses students on those standards starting in third grade via the PSSAs. The PSSAs are directly tied to the academic standards, and teachers and schools are required to teach those standards. And therefore, we have a direct line between what is expected to be taught in the class and those state standards. And those state standards are then a direct link or correlate to the federal regulations, which say, in order for a student to meet the first criterion for SLD determination, they first have to demonstrate that they are not achieving grade level standards. And therefore, we believe, we meaning myself, Joe Kowaleski, Amanda Vanderhayden, colleagues across the Commonwealth, as well as colleagues across the nation who embrace RTI logic, believe that really most schools have plenty of data already that they can use, they can tap into to operationalize the extent to which the student has achieved or failed to achieve those grade level standards. Particularly if you are in a school that is using MTSS or RTI approaches for service delivery. If you're in a school that is using MTSS or RTI processes for service delivery, then you've got plenty of data already that you can tap into to evaluate the extent to which this first criterion has been met. For example, once a kid has completed third grade and beyond, you've got statewide annual testing data, such as PSSAs, and as we move into the secondary grades, you've got keystones, although admittedly, most students who are identified for SLD would likely be identified in elementary school, so you would probably be relying very heavily on those PSSA data. But of course, we don't have PSSAs in kindergarten, first, and second grade, but we've got other data that we can tap into from kindergarten, first, and second grade that could be just as useful for evaluating the extent to which this first criterion has been met. Some districts elect to do some sort of district-wide assessment in kindergarten, first, or second grade. My former school district, going back, of course, a number of years, used to administer the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. I know that's relatively old and it's an imperfect measure, but it is a measure nonetheless that assesses academic skills in some of those earlier grades prior to the PSSA being administered. But again, if you're using MTSS for service delivery, you've got an abundance of data that can be used to quantify performance level. You got benchmark data from your triannual screeners. And those benchmark data, particularly the last or most recently administered benchmark assessment, ought to be plenty good for establishing performance level, with one important caveat listed here. You need someone, and this is where your school site colleagues can find themselves generally useful in many ways other than just testing kids for special education eligibility. Reach out to your school psych and ask them to find out, are our benchmark assessments technically adequate? Now, that is a term that is a little dorky, but it is a reference to the reliability and validity properties of your benchmark assessment. Making a decision about whether a student has a disability or not is, in most people's view, a high stakes decision. It is life-changing. And because it is a life-changing decision, we need to make sure that the data that we are using to make that decision are of really high quality. Because if we're making a life-changing decision about a student based upon bad data, then we potentially are making a very damaging decision about a student that will alter the rest of their lives. Nobody wants to do that. Consequently, we all need to make sure as school systems that the data we are using to make high stakes decisions, such as does this kid have a disability, are based off of data that have very high psychometric qualities, meaning very high reliability and validity. Now, thankfully, tests like the PSSA have already demonstrated extremely high reliability and validity indices, so we know those are good data. If you're using a district-wide assessment other than the PSSA, you want to make sure that you're assessing the quality of those assessment data before using them for making eligibility decisions. But if you're going to use benchmark assessment data, your thrice annual universal screener that you use within your school, make sure you're checking to see that the reliability is at least 0.9 or above. And you need to check this because not all benchmark or universal screeners are created equal. And in fact, a very helpful resource that I implore all of you to go to is this website, which is linked right here. It is the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and it gives a whole lot of information regarding the technical adequacies of most publicly available screeners. What I have here is the actual website itself, and you can see these are, well, maybe, hopefully you can, if you haven't been here before, let me orient you a little bit. Make sure that you are looking at the tab for screeners, because as we'll see in a moment, there is a separate tab for progress monitoring tools. Make sure you're looking at the screeners, and you will also know that because it says academic screenings tools chart. The products themselves are listed alphabetically, so Acadience, because alphabetically they are the first amongst all of the commercially available products, will appear first, but please do not take that as implicit endorsement by me or others that Acadience is the best. It is one of many. And then if you're familiar at all with the consumer reports approach to making it easy for us to understand how the appraisal is made, then you can see that a completely filled in circle means the evidence is overwhelming that this is a high quality instrument for screening purposes. A partially filled in circle means there's modest data to support that it's a high quality instrument. And then anything that's either an open or unfilled circle or a slash means that you should probably reconsider the quality of that screener for eligibility decision-making purposes. Now you can notice these are all broken down by vendor or the actual instrument itself, what area, and then as well grade. This is a quick view of the overall technical adequacy. If, however, you want to help your school psychologist be even more generally useful to the schools and school systems, then invite your school psychologist to click on one of these. And they can click on one of those, and then they can read all the gory details about how those consumer reports icons were derived, literally listing out the sample that was used to generate the technical adequacy data, and then as appropriate, giving those numbers themselves, as well as applicable, the references to independent or peer-reviewed research regarding those technical adequacy data that were reported. This is the kind of stuff that I'm reading while on vacation and my family is making fun of me because I get to geek out on all of these numbers. Again, not for the faint of heart, and certainly not something that we expect teachers to necessarily spend their time reviewing, not because they can't do it, but because they've got far better things to do. This is where your school psych can be abundantly helpful in terms of gauging the quality from a psychometric perspective of your universal screeners that you are using. Okay, make sure that you are critically evaluating the extent to which that universal screener is technically adequate. I have a few screenshots here in the PowerPoint materials for those of you who maybe are unable to go to or navigate to the website, or they can, but they've got too many windows open and they're becoming overwhelmed with the sheer volume of windows that they have on their screen. But notably, here are highlighted some of those performance standards for Acadians reading, which also happens to be Dibble's Next. For those of you who maybe are a little bit confused, you're thinking, Dibble's Next, is that the same as Acadians? For all intents and purposes, the measures themselves are equivalent. So here we go. If you look at, for example, kindergarten, the kindergarten performance standards of Acadians are less than ideal in terms of alternate form, but inter-rater reliability is pretty good. So it's kind of a mixed bag. If we then move on to, say, for example, easy CBM, especially in the upper grades, our median reliability coefficients are less than ideal. So you might want to reconsider whether or not easy CBM is sufficient for making high stakes decisions, particularly at some of these grade levels. We look at FastBridge. FastBridge data are reported there. Please understand, I make no money off of any of these products. I have no vested interest in what schools are using from a financial perspective. I do, however, have a vested interest in making sure that schools are equipped with the resources to gauge whether or not the materials they are using are appropriate. Okay, so you want to also, in addition to reliability evidence, you want to look at validity evidence. And of course, that website also has evidence of validity that you can peruse. Now, there are various forms of validity and not, this is a session on validity, but there are multiple types of validity, and two that are probably of utmost importance for RTI would be predictive and concurrent validity. And there, unfortunately, is no consensus on what is a minimum standard of predictive or concurrent validity. And what I'm about to say is purely my opinion. Take it or leave it, but my opinion is that you would like to see predictive and or concurrent validity estimates of at least 0.6 and above. And in a moment, I'll show you some screenshots of what those look like for some of the more commonly used universal screeners, but I do want to attend to the question that came up in the chat about, are the assessments listed on the intensive intervention sites screeners? A brief response to that question is yes. The link that I have in the PowerPoint on that particular slide takes you directly to the screeners. The link that Erica put in the chat immediately above this comment is the link to the main website. You have to make sure that once you land on the main website that you select the screeners tool tab, not the progress monitoring tool tab. That'll get you to a different but related side of that website. So please make sure, and here I'll actually go back for illustrative purposes. I'll go back to intervention, intensiveintervention.org. So if you go on the landing page, you want to go to tools chart and make sure that you are going to academic screening chart for this first criterion, because that's your screener. Remember, the screeners are given 3 times a year. In a little bit, we're going to have you go to the academic progress monitoring chart, but hold off, don't go there just yet. For now, we're looking at the academic screeners chart, and you will know that you are on the appropriate one for criterion 1 because it will say academic screeners tools chart. That is how you correctly navigate to the right information. It's pretty easy to go to the wrong one, and the only way you would know the difference is that this title will read differently. So make sure you're seeing academic screening tools chart. Okay, going back into the PowerPoint. There we go. All right. There is, again, as I noted, no minimum consensus on what is an appropriate standard for predictive or concurrent validity. My opinion is 0.6 or above. And again, if you go back into the screening tools tab of that website and then select the measure that you are using, or if you're on the market to purchase a new product, then you should use this to guide your decision making at a district or building level. Then you can see some of the median coefficients for validity evidence listed there. And this is another opportunity for your school psychologists to be generally useful, because they ought to know what predictive or construct validity is, and they should also know what is meant by the test or the criterion. This is not something that I would expect an administrator or a teacher to spend their summer vacations reading, but I hope that school psychs would consider that. Again, finding opportunities to improve the systems in which we work. This is for Acadians. And then we have obviously many, many more. You can find those on the website. Fundamentally then, if we're using MTSS and RTI for eligibility decision-making under the category of specific learning disability, then we have plenty of data. We have plenty of data. As I already said, you could use the PSSAs or district-wide assessment. You could use a benchmark assessment, the most recent benchmark assessment, so long as they meet minimum standards of technical adequacy. You can also, here's yet some more options. You could use progress monitoring data. If, for example, you haven't universally screened a kid in a few months, and that kid is now being considered for special education eligibility, and it's premature to give the next benchmark assessment, you could, in theory, use the last 3 progress monitoring data points. And we would argue, take the median, rank order the last 3 progress monitoring data points, and then take the one in the middle and use that as evidence of whether or not a student meets that first criterion of have they achieved benchmark standards per either their age or grade level expectations. Now, again, because you're using progress monitoring data for a high stakes decision, you want to make sure that those data are technically sound. And therefore, the same rules of minimum standards of reliability apply as they were applied when we were reviewing the screening technical adequacy. Same minimum standard is universally accepted for a high stakes decision. The reliabilities must be at least 0.9. And if they aren't 0.9 or above, then don't use those data for a high stakes decision, such as, does this kid have a specific learning disability? That same intensive intervention website has data regarding the degree with which a whole host of progress monitoring tools meet that minimum standard of reliability. I'm going to go back to that website, again, the live website, and hit the landing page. Instead of selecting academic screening chart, you go to academic progress monitoring chart. It looks very similar. In fact, it's pretty easy to confuse the two. The one noticeable distinction is that the title will say progress monitoring tools chart. That's really the only difference. My one complaint with the people who maintain this website is that visually the sites for universal screeners and progress monitoring are too similar that it's very easy to confuse them. And so if I may offer my humble opinion to anybody who has any influence over this website, it would be maybe changing the visual layout so that it is visually discriminable between the universal screener side of the website and the progress monitoring one. So make sure you're on the right one. But similarly to what we were just reviewing, everything is alphabetized. You can, and they have the general information on the right-hand side. You can click on any one of the products. So let's pick on AIMSweb for a moment. And we've got AIMSweb Math, Quantity, Total Fluency, and you can look at all the gory details about how the evidence was derived to conclude whether or not it met those minimum standards of technical adequacy. Okay, going back into our PowerPoint. Sorry, so you want to make sure that if you're using progress monitoring data and the median of the last 3, that the data that you're using have achieved minimum standards of reliability. And again, some screenshots. Here's one of Acadian's. Again, validity data for the progress monitoring tool, not the screener, but for the progress monitoring tool. Also here is for STAR. Some more on STAR as it relates to validity. It is our opinion, meaning when I say our, I mean Joe Kowaleski, Amanda Vanderheyden, myself, and many others, that if you're using MTSS for service delivery and then subsequently using RTI logic for SLD determination, then there probably is very little reason to use any sort of norm reference test for establishing a minimum level of performance. Does the student meet that first criterion? In fact, there are few exceptions in our opinion as to the need for a norm reference test. Clearly, if you are using as your measure of performance level, that first criterion, if your benchmark assessment or your progress monitoring tools have suboptimal standards of reliability and validity, then yes, by all means, administer a standardized norm reference assessment of academic skills. And we also would say the other caveat is, or the other exception would be, if you are exclusively addressing the extent to which a student might have a specific learning disability in written expression, oral expression, or listening comprehension, then we would also advocate for the completion of a norm referenced test of written expression, oral expression, or listening comprehension. Why? Well, first of all, there are no benchmark assessments or progress monitoring tool correlates for oral expression and written comprehension. So we don't really have the equivalent of that in those two areas. But specifically for written expression, while we do have universal screeners and progress monitoring tools for written expression, their technical adequacy still remains relatively unknown. And therefore, we in good faith and good conscience cannot advocate for the exclusionary use of benchmark or progress monitoring written expression probes for a high stakes decision in the area of written expression. Thus, we recommend that if you're looking at a kid who might be eligible for SLD and written expression, then please, by all means, administer a norm referenced assessment of written expression, such as selected subtests of the standard batteries of assessments that school psychologists typically give. But what you'll notice, I hope, is that in the areas of mathematics and reading, we see no need for additional testing using standardized norm referenced assessments for the identification of specific learning disabilities. And we also see no need for the evaluation of a student's cognitive abilities, commonly referred to as an IQ test. We see there being no need for that whatsoever, frankly, for a variety of reasons that I don't want to get too far into, but we just don't see them being useful at all for the identification of SLD, specifically in any area, but particularly given that we have so much more helpful, rich information that can be gathered from our academic assessments that we complete as standard protocol within an MTSS service delivery model. Therefore, we advocate that in most instances, especially in reading and mathematics, you use your existing benchmark assessments, your progress monitoring assessments, and PSSA data if you have them, because the kid is of a grade in which PSSAs have already been administered. But the question still remains, what is an operationalization of adequate level of performance? Or as we refer to it as, how low is too low for a kid to meet that first criterion of failing to achieve adequate standards in reading, mathematics, written expression, listening comprehension, and oral expression. Regrettably, there is no consensus in the empirical literature as to what is an exact line of demarcation for if a kid falls below this threshold, they absolutely are too low. Or if a kid falls above that line, then they are achieving at least adequately enough where they should not be identified as having an SLD. I'll get to the comment that just came up in a moment, but let me finish out this thought. Despite there being no consensus in the empirical literature, there is a coalescing in the literature around the utilization of percentile ranks as a way to operationalize performance level. Misiak and colleagues in 2016 noted that most empirical studies that look at this question of what's considered to be too low usually rely on a percentile rank as the metric by which a criterion or a line in the sand is then drawn. Now, if we're going to use that, and we, meaning my colleagues and I who have been working on this and are putting out this book here in the next couple of months, advocate for using percentile ranks. And since we're using percentile ranks, that of course means that we're applying a criterion to the normal curve. Now, not to get too far into this discussion about normal curves, but we do know that the average range on the normal curve begins at the 25th percentile rank. Now, many proficiency minimums on benchmark assessments, whether you're using Acadian's, EasyCBM, STAR, or FastBridge, or any of the very popular, and many of those are of high quality assessments, their threshold of level of risk on those universal screeners fluctuates between the 30th and 40th percentile rank. In other words, if a kid is no or low risk, that means they've probably performed at the 30th percentile rank, or maybe the 35th or the 40th. It kind of changes depending upon the specific measure that you're using. But generally speaking, the level of risk demarcating between no or low risk and some heightened level of risk falls between the 30th and 40th percentile rank. Notably, that 30th and 40th percentile rank is actually a little bit above the average range, or at least the low end of the average range. Food for thought there to suggest that maybe our universal screeners have very high expectations for what is considered to be no or low risk. But fundamentally, IDEA does not indicate what that threshold or the criterion should be for establishment of either the kid is too low or the kid is good enough in terms of the level of proficiency. And because we live in a wonderful place that is a commonwealth, meaning in this instance, local decisions local school districts drive the decisions that are made within their local school district, then it is incumbent upon the local educational agency, that is the school district, to establish the criterion for what is adequate versus inadequate level. Now, some argue that the 10th percentile rank and below is a reasonable threshold to establish a kid is either too low and thus would meet that first criterion, or if they're above that threshold, they're not low enough. I hate to kind of say that. That makes it sound like we're disappointed that the kid isn't struggling enough. But in essence, that's what we're saying. And so we argue that the bulk, if not the overwhelming amount of data that a school has on a kid in terms of their level, should all coalesce around a similar decision. In other words, if you've got outlier data that's like one assessment said this kid's doing quite well, or one or two data points to say this kid's doing quite well, then you can't ignore that. You have to take the totality of data. And for a kid to be identified as having a specific learning disability, the data must all very clearly point to low performance. And we suggest that that you look at a percentile rank as the primary means by which to establish whether or not a student is low enough and thus indicative of achieving that first criterion for SLD. And of course, you have to consider the psychometric qualities of the data that you're using to make that decision. And I've already gone over that in previous slides when we were looking at that intensive intervention website. So what I'd like you to do now is we're going to now jump to the evaluation report that was provided as part of the materials for today's session. And we're going to talk about Jane Doe. Jane Doe's ER, which you now have in your hands, either physically, tangibly, or virtually on your device, is actually a real case. Although this is not the image of the real student, this happens to be the image of our youngest daughter when she was in first grade, and she's now in 8th grade. So not the actual student. But what I'd like you to do is briefly review the data provided on the first 2 pages of the evaluation report. So briefly, and I mean very briefly, skim through the first 2 pages, including the reason for referral and the sources of evaluation data. And when you get to the observations, which is on the 2nd page, just skim through the observations made by Mrs. Teacher. You do not need to review the observations that begin on page 3 because we're going to review them a little bit later on. Erica has put in the chat, again, the link to the Google Drive by which you can then access the ER. And what I'd like you to do is I'm just going to give you 3-4 minutes to skim through pages 1 and 2 so you understand the context of this evaluation report. And Gino's question in the chat, I will address here in a few minutes. This is the time at which I'm going to awkwardly be silent. All of us are going to be silent so you can have an opportunity to quickly review pages 1 and 2 of the ER. Perhaps maybe just another 30 seconds to review pages 1 and 2 in brief. Okay, hopefully by this point in time, you've had a chance to briefly review pages 1 and 2 so you can understand the context of Jane, who is entering into the 2nd grade. And as you noted in your brief review of pages 1 and 2, was experiencing some difficulties in the area of reading and language arts while in 1st grade. Okay, now what I'd like you to do is we're going to quickly review some sources of evaluation data, which is, there's a listing of those evaluation data on pages 1 and 2. But now what I'd like you to do is focus briefly on the actual data themselves. And what's highlighted or bolded here, excuse me, on our slide is an emphasis on reviewing information on pages 7, 9, and 10, 7, 9, and 10. But instead of reading all of the narrative, I encourage you to look at the graphs and the tables on page 7 and 9. In fact, I'm going to jump ahead to give you even more explicit instruction on what I'd like you to look at. If you turn to page 7, you should see a graph, and on page 9, you should see a table. And I want you to focus your attention for these few moments on the data that are outlined with a red box on the screen that you have in front of you. So again, I want you to spend just a few minutes looking at page 7, and in specific, the graph on page 7, as well as on page 9, the tabular summary that I have indicated here. The graphical representation would be the last 3 data points in the student's progress monitoring chart. And then in the table, we see end of year nonsense word fluency correct letter sequences, end of year benchmark score, as well as, so these two visuals are for nonsense word fluency. And then I'm going to jump ahead. On page 10, we see the visual and tabular display of oral reading fluency data, with, again, an emphasis on the last couple of data points in terms of benchmark assessment of oral reading fluency in the spring, in the visual graph, as well as ending performance, end of year oral reading fluency in a tabular or numerical representation. So to summarize, look at pages 7, 9, and 10 with a heavier emphasis on the visuals and not so much on the narrative. Although if you want to spend a few moments skimming through the narrative, of course, please do that. So I'll give a minute or two for you to digest that information before coming back. Okay, another 15 seconds, and then I'm going to start up kind of reviewing what I hope you gain from looking at these images. Okay, I'm going to go backwards in the PowerPoint, and if you want to look at the PowerPoint, that's fine. If you instead want to look at the ER, then that's fine as well. I'll direct you to which page and what I'm actually talking about if you're looking in the ER. Pages 7 and 9, the images on 7 and 9 reference nonsense word fluency correct letter sequences, or letter sounds, excuse me. One's in a visual display in terms of a time series graph, of course, and the other is in tabular form. Since we're right now talking about the first criterion for SLD determination, that is performance level, we want to look at the most recent evaluative data and the extent to which Jane has achieved or not achieved grade level expectations. To orient you to the graph, not to get into too far into this because we're going to kind of chunk the information that's contained in this graph over the course of this morning's session. What I'm most interested in you kind of focusing on right now are the blue triangles. Those are the progress monitoring data that have been collected over weeks and months, and then from Jane. The yellow line represents typical performance, that's benchmark performance, and then the green, just briefly, the green was where Jane was right at the start of the new calendar year. And then the line represents a goal line, like where we want Jane to, where we want her to be by the end of the year, was to close the gap and to be no different than her peers who are not at risk. And therefore, then the green line is what we refer to as the goal line, more on that in a little bit. But so here, the blue triangles represent where she was each particular week. And then, of course, at the end of the academic year, we have a few progress monitoring data. And this last data point actually represents her final benchmark assessment. That data point right there is reflected down here in the table. She scored a 38, which corresponds to the 10th percentile rank. Please don't worry about all the other stuff in this table. For now, we're going to get to all that other stuff later. For now, we're talking about performance level, the first criterion. So I want you to focus exclusively on what I have highlighted or outlined in a red box. You can see from these data that her her benchmark assessment performance at the end of the year was at the 10th percentile rank for nonsense word fluency. That's the takeaway. If we look at oral reading fluency on page 10, whether it's visual in terms of a time series graph or tabular, you will see that the spring oral reading fluency benchmark assessment that Jane completed, she was at the 6th percentile rank. In sum, then, her nonsense word fluency was at the 10th percentile rank, and her oral reading fluency performance was at the 6th percentile rank. Again, focusing on percentile rank as an indication or a metric or operationalization of performance level. Now, we also have some standardized norm reference assessments that you could look at. Those are on pages 11 and 12. By the way, because I didn't want to get bogged down into what version of the CTOP or the Wyatt is being used in this illustration, I just made up the latest edition of both the CTOP and the Wyatt. And similarly, the progress monitoring assessment and the universal screener, of course, it may not necessarily correspond to the most recent version of the one that's out there right now, but I hope we can move beyond that for our purposes here today. I did include standardized norm reference assessments that were administered, but please understand these were absolutely unnecessary. This was not necessary at all, but the MDT elected to administer the CTOP and the Wyatt as well. But those data are presented in table format on page 11. Now, we have performance level data from nonsense word fluency, correct letter sounds, and we have oral reading fluency data. If you're familiar at all with the evaluation report, you know that the latter third or so of the evaluation report is specific to whether or not a kid is eligible for special education under SLD, commonly known as the determination of SLD worksheet. That to me is the summary of everything that to me is where we place a summary of everything that was contained on pages 7 through 11 in graphic detail. And instead, beginning on page 19 of the ER that you have is the first of many things that must be addressed in the determination of SLD worksheet. So if you have access to the virtual or paper version of the ER, turn to page 19, and you will see a summary table on page 19 that aggregates the universal screening data, the progress monitoring data, and I put in there the standardized norm reference assessment data, but please recall that those are absolutely unnecessary for this particular case because we've got ample data from our universal screener and progress monitoring tools. Now, the comprehensive review of all that data can be found on pages 6 through 12 of the ER, but we're going to focus on page 19. And this is an excerpt from page 19. Notice what I have indicated, what is indicated, in the top half of this slide is the LEA's criteria that they have established for whether or not the student meets eligibility for special education services under SLD based upon level of performance, that first criterion. The school district established, and I think this is very wise, that school districts proactively establish a threshold, and then that threshold is used universally across all schools. We do not want to have schools in the same district having different thresholds or lines in the sand for what is considered adequate or inadequate performance level. If we have different thresholds within the same school district, then a kid could be eligible for SLD in one building, but ineligible in another building, and that's problematic. Your zip code should not dictate whether or not you have a specific learning disability. Therefore, we strongly advocate that school districts establish the criterion for performance level and then use that universally across all buildings in their district. Now, of course, the district 3 miles away might have a different threshold, but we can't control that. That is the beauty or the frustration, depending upon how you look at it, of us living in a commonwealth where individual school districts can make that decision. Other states dictate that statewide because they're not commonwealths. Because we are a commonwealth, then individual school districts make that decision. This school district established what I would view to be a very reasonable, empirically supported threshold of 10th percentile rank. When looking at performance level, the data should all say performance is at or below the 10th percentile rank. And if that is the case, then the student meets that first criterion as having a performance level that fails to meet grade level standards. And that is what we have here when we look at the tabular summary of data. Nonsense word fluency, correct letter sounds was at the 10th percentile rank, or reading fluency was at the 6th. And we could have stopped right there. That's plenty good data to tell us that the student meets that first criterion. But if you want to use the CTOP or the WIATS or some other standardized norm reference assessment, go ahead. It's a waste of time, frankly, in my opinion. But if we have those data, we should be sharing them as well. And in this case, those data also fell below the 10th percentile rank. So then, this school district established its criterion as 10th percentile rank or below. I'm going to finally get to Gino's question from the chat box. Gino asked a question about Shin's rule still applicable for determining what is too low. And I would say probably an easier, more empirically defensible criterion is based on percentile ranks. While Shin's work was very informative at the time, we have far better tools and metrics that we have at our disposal to make a much more defensible, both from an empirical perspective as well as from a theoretical or Bayesian perspective, that a percentile rank is a much more appropriate approach to establishing the criterion for performance level. And if I were in charge, if I were on the team in a school district charged with making that determination of what is the line in the sand that we draw, I would say 10th percentile rank. But that's just my opinion. It is just as appropriate for a school district to say we're going to set it at 7th percentile rank or even 5th percentile rank. I think it gets a little untenable if school districts consider a percentile rank above the 10th percentile rank as the threshold for achieving or not achieving grade level standards. Just simply, it's a numbers matter. It's a base rate issue. You're going to have a lot of kids being identified as having an SLD if your threshold for performance level is at, say, the 20th percentile rank or the 15th. And so therefore, I would caution against going anything above the 10th percentile rank. The other question in the chat was, the charts are awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that. And so do my colleagues who helped develop them. The additional question was, is there a particular software used to develop them? And I would say the software to create the graphs was Excel, and to create the tables was nothing more than Word. And I may not be able to do it here immediately today, but for those interested, I can work through Patton to post a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet that has a template that generates those visuals as well as some exemplars. It's something that will take me more than just a couple of seconds to find. And then maybe, Erica, is that something we could post to your Google spot?
Yeah, so we could have that uploaded to the Google folder that you shared today.
Okay. What I will do is at our break, I will do my best to find that real quick and send it over to Erica, and then she can post it. Great. Okay. I hope that made sense. Again, not an expectation that you've read everything on those pages in the ER. I am of the opinion that a table and a visual representation such as a graph can speak volumes. And in fact, if constructed well, facilitate a review of an evaluation report that doesn't require a deep dive into the narrative. And therefore, that's why I focus our attention on the tables and the graphs, excuse me, as opposed to asking you to read pages and pages of narrative, which of course need to be in there, but I find the visuals to be far more efficient and effective at getting the point across in terms of the content related to performance level. Okay, so asking you to annotate again, using that stamping feature. How you feeling about performance level? Are you feeling like, all right, all right, all right? You know, Matthew McConaughey from Dazed and Confused. That's a strange reference, I realize, but so you're feeling pretty good about it? Or if you say, whoa, slow down, I have some questions, and then of course, ask those questions. Or if you're thinking, oh my gosh, my head hurts, I need a break, I'm about to explode. All right, it looks like everybody's feeling like they're all right, all right, all right. Fantastic. Okay, we are an hour and a half into our session, and I'm thinking this might be a good time to take a break, a stretch break, and this will also give me a time to find that Excel spreadsheet, send it to Erica, and then she can do her magic by posting it. So why don't we take a break? Erica, is 15 minutes too much time?
That's perfect.
Okay, I put you on the spot there. It was like either missed. Oh, and thank you, Erica. Yes, we're recording again, just as a reminder. There were a few questions that came up in the chat before our break that I wanted to revisit and address as best I can. One of those questions was distinguishing the language of RTI and MTSS. Are they used interchangeably? In the literature, at least historically, those words, those acronyms were used interchangeably, which is unfortunate because they actually are different things. And I am just as guilty as anybody else in terms of using those terms interchangeably. And I need to get better at that. Erica Karuta responded very eloquently in the chat by reminding us that MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, is a system for structuring resources and the allocation of those resources to support all students. It's a system. RTI, responsiveness to intervention, is a method that is embedded within MTSS, used to strategically assess and provide intervention for students based upon their specific needs. MTSS is the system, RTI is a method of decision-making and allocating resources for specific kids within an MTSS system. And again, I apologize for at times using those acronyms interchangeably when in fact, technically they are not necessarily the same. That was one comment that came up. Another one was a question about whether a school in Pennsylvania is permitted to use RTI, that is the method or the process, if they're allowed to use RTI for SLD determination if they have not yet applied to the state for that approval. And I'm going to punt this one to my patent colleagues. I believe I know the answer, but I don't want to speak on behalf of PDE. Erica, Karen, somebody bail me out here.
I saw Karen unmute first. I'm going to put a training in the calendar while Karen addresses it.
So if you're interested in using RTI for SLD determination in the state of Pennsylvania, you would want to go to the patent website and pull down the Fidelity tool that allows teams to go through a roadmap process of evaluating their system and giving themselves some rankings, 0, 1, or 2. And then you would go through that process with your team, and then you would pull in either your IU or patent consultant to just go over that conversation with you. The process that we have in place right now is less cumbersome than in the past. You do not need to submit evidence, evidential documents and things like that. You're simply evaluating your system, going through the process, and when you feel that your team is ready, you would apply and send your Fidelity tool to Shan and I. And that document we'll put in the chat a little bit later. So you would need to go through the process of filling out that implementation tool and submitting it to Shan and I. And then with you and the Bureau, there would be a conversation and you go from there. So you would need to go through that process to use RTI for SLD determination, but that does not preclude you from building your multi-tiered system of support and building those infrastructure types of pieces. So I hope that answered that question.
Thank you, Karen. And what I want to also underscore is that PDE is making this approval process a lot easier than it was historically, which I know I'm being recorded, but I'll say it anyway. I found rather frustrating that there are 3 ways to identify kids as SLD according to IDEA, and technically actually only 2 of them are permissible in Pennsylvania. But of those ones, only 1 required all these hoops to jump through. And I never quite understood why there were these additional approval processes for schools to use something that frankly is contemporary, is in the best interest of kids, compared to ability achievement discrepancy, which has no evidentiary support whatsoever. Everybody agrees is not valid, yet there was no requirement from the state to necessarily document and have approval to use that approach. Therefore, I applaud PDE's very cautious and very appropriately so, cautious approach toward allowing schools to use RTI as a process or a method within an MTSS system to identify SLD. And I welcome a continued movement in that direction moving forward. Okay, another question that came up in the chat was, I believe, in regards to the various data that you could use to establish performance level. And as I noted, one of the very first ones you could look at would be statewide assessments according to Every Student Succeeds Act, the SSA requirements. And somebody rightfully so pointed out the obvious, we didn't have PSSAs for a few years there. And that is true. I sometimes wonder how many years in the future it's going to be where we can actually stop mentioning COVID-related stuff in schools, but sadly, that's going to be quite some time. A valid point. And all the more reason why, if you are a school that is using MTSS as a system, you should still have universal screening data. And you therefore don't necessarily have to wait for the next PSSA. You can use your universal screening data, assuming they have adequate technical properties, as your measure of performance level. You don't have to make up or wait for the next PSSA, given the fact that PSSAs were skipped for, as I understand, actually, I guess it was just 1 year that PSSAs were skipped. I might have misspoken earlier, but still nonetheless, a valid point. And thank you to whomever raised that point in the chat. Okay. Keep those questions coming. And also over the break, I sent Erica the Excel spreadsheet used to generate those graphs. Yes. This is an Excel spreadsheet that I created. It is not glamorous. It's not glitzy. It is by no means great, but it is functional. And therefore, you can use that at your leisure. There are 2 completed illustrations that should look very, very similar to the ER document that you have in front of you, as well as a template where you enter in your data following the brief directions I gave. And then it automatically, if you've entered in the data correctly, it will automatically compute growth, measures of growth or indices of growth. And for my students who are attending this session, who experienced utilizing that Excel spreadsheet just last week in class, I've made the appropriate corrections that we ran into last week. So it is there on the Google Drive that Erica has posted numerous times in the chat.
Can I just pause real quick? One more question popped in. I know
yes.
You just addressed ability achievement. Is PSW, pattern of cognitive strengths and weaknesses, permissible to use in PA for SLD determination?
That is a legal landmine that I will cautiously walk through. Up to a few years ago, the answer was no. Pennsylvania did not permit the utilization of patterns of cognitive strengths and weaknesses from a legal perspective, and I know schools are using it. That said, I am not sure, honestly, I'm not sure if PDE permits that, if they've changed their position. And I don't want to put patent folks on the spot. But if anybody knows with a high degree of certainty what the current position is from PDE, please chime in. But I do know that up to and including just a few years ago, pattern of strengths and weaknesses was not permitted in Pennsylvania. So I don't know if any patent or IU colleagues can answer more affirmatively with more recent evidence.
Are you referring to the document from 2008, Tim, the specific learning disabilities guidelines? To my knowledge, that has not been updated.
To my knowledge, it hasn't either, but I honestly do not track that because admittedly, the world of cognitive strengths and weaknesses is not a world in which I live.
Yeah, so that guidance document, as far as I know, is still the guidance document that is out there.
I would just, if nothing else, if you're in a school or your school cycle uses pattern of strengths and weaknesses, I would be very cautious in using that approach. Even though training programs and many of us are quite familiar with that approach, the guidance document to which Dr. Hunter was referencing just a few moments ago is the one that I believe my formulation of a position is based upon as well. Pointed out that pattern of strengths and weaknesses was not permissible in Pennsylvania, until at least 2008, if not more recently as well, but we're just not aware of any recent changes. Okay. All right, here we go. We're moving on now. We only got through one agenda item. Oh my gosh. Well, actually, remember, we've been going through the comprehensive ER, so we've actually addressed, to some extent, the last one as well in some detail. We now move on to the operationalization of responsiveness to intervention, or RTI. Remember, RTI is the method that we use to measure growth within an MTSS system. Trying to be clear on my use of those terms so that I don't continue to perpetrate the confusion in the field. Okay, if we're going back to this visual representation of the 4 criteria for SLD determination with a heavy emphasis on 1 and 2 in today's session, then what we are doing is we are now about to embark on a review of how we operationalize the second criterion. Notably, it's the top half of this box that has been shaded dark. The top half, and I'm not trying to insult your intelligence, but I want to emphasize the top half is RTI. The bottom half is either IQ achievement discrepancy or pattern of strengths and weaknesses. And again, we're not 100% certain as to the extent to which pattern of strengths and weaknesses is permissible in Pennsylvania, but clearly ability achievement discrepancy is permitted in Pennsylvania. So we do know that. But what we're about to review here in our morning workshop in this portion of it is the top half of that box. How do you measure responsiveness to intervention? And here's the language from IDEA, of course, with an emphasis on the language specific to measuring responsiveness to intervention. Note that we have to measure a child's response to scientific research-based intervention. The presumption is within an MTSS system, and this is, I imagine, part of that self-reflection and approval process with PDE, is that schools are using at tier 2 and tier 3 interventions that are known to work. And also that they're using a tier 1 core curriculum that, in the area of reading, for example, addresses the 5 big ideas in reading, right? Because that's what science says should be taught. And in the area of math, we're teaching math procedures as well as math computational skills and other math reasoning skills. So we have to document in an RTI process that the MTSS system is using evidence-based practices. And that is key, fundamental to us praising the extent to which a student is responsive to intervention. Now, how do we operationalize responsiveness to intervention? As currently operationalized both in the literature and, frankly, in how this is operationalized by commercial products. In other words, the progress monitoring tools that schools are using. Joe Kowaleski, Amanda Vayner, Hayden, and I, and others believe that there are three primary methods of operationalizing RTI. And the method of RTI is driven almost exclusively by the product that your school or district uses to measure progress. Those three methods are rate of improvement, or ROI, student growth percentiles, SGPs, and mastery measurement. Now, I'm asking you to please do that annotating stamping feature once again and self-evaluate your familiarity with rate of improvement, student growth percentiles, or mastery measurement. Are you pretty good on them? Are you so-so? Or are you in the area or the self-reflection area of, I just don't know. I've barely even heard of that. And therefore, you're ideally you're responding 3 times, once for rate of improvement, once for student growth percentiles, and once for mastery measurement. And as the data are still coming in, I'll try my best to summarize. It looks like we're a little bit more familiar with ROI and SGPs. And as a whole, we are less familiar with mastery measurement. Okay. And if you have not done so already, please stop the annotation. Therefore, you don't inadvertently start stamping in another slide, which is kind of funny when that happens. And don't worry, no big deal. We can delete them all, but make sure that you stop that. So we're going to summarize that our group collectively is stronger with rate of improvement in student growth percentiles than they are with mastery measurement. But because we had some respondents that were kind of in the middle across all 3 areas, we're going to spend some time reviewing each of them. I don't have any empirical data to support this conclusion. It's just more of a gut. My gut feeling is that most schools are going to be using rate of improvement and student growth percentiles because that's the metric that is generated by their product. Mastery measurement is far less commonly seen in practice because it is typically wedded to or connected to very specific universal screeners, benchmarking, and instruction and intervention packages, most notably Spring Math. Spring Math, which is being used with increasing frequency across the Commonwealth, typically uses a mastery measurement approach as its metric for operationalizing responsiveness to intervention. So we're going to talk about all 3, but most of you likely are going to be using rate of improvement and student growth percentile ranks because that's what your product generates. Okay, so let's take a look at rate of improvement. Rate of improvement, or ROI. If you've been familiar with progress monitoring research or practice over the last couple of decades, then this is going to be somewhat of a review with a focus on 3 rates of improvement that we believe are most beneficial for calculating and interpreting. The 3 ROIs that we believe to be most beneficial for calculating and interpreting are attained ROI, benchmark ROI, and goal ROI. Attained ROI is how the student actually progresses across time. It's their growth that they attain. Benchmark ROI is the typical performance across time of students on the benchmarking assessment. And then goal ROI is the rate of growth or the responsiveness that we hope our student that we're focused on achieves over a period of time. Now, I'm going to illustrate these benchmark, goal, and attained ROIs on subsequent slides. For now, what is most important is that you understand that we advocate for calculating and considering 3 ROIs: attained, which is the student's actual performance over time; benchmark ROI, which is typical growth over time; and goal ROI, which is our ideal if we help the student close the achievement gap with their non-disabled peers. How do you compute these? The visual on the left-hand side should look very, very familiar. I'm pretty sure that it is the same one that we were reviewing for the break in Jane's ER. But more importantly, on the right-hand side are the calculation of benchmark, goal, and attained ROI. Benchmark ROI, very easy to compute. You take the ending point and subtract the beginning point, and you divide by the number of days. Notably here, we recommend that the divisor is the number of calendar days, not instructional weeks, not instructional days, but actual days. And if you want to geek out on why we recommend that, I will draw your attention to some work that I collaborated with Caitlin Benioff, Matt Furchuk, and Annie McRae, all school psychs from Pennsylvania a few years ago, in which we lay out a mathematical justification for why the number of calendar days is best when calculating any of these rates of improvement. This is somewhat of a deviation from previous recommendations, which recommended either using calendar weeks or instructional weeks or even school days. We are advocating for using the number of calendar days as your divisor. Take your ending point, subtract your beginning point, and divide by the number of days. And that gives you a daily benchmark rate of improvement. In other words, what typical kids are gaining each day. Now that's going to be a pretty small number because it's per day. You can easily convert that to a weekly metric by just taking that number and multiplying it by 7 to get you an average growth per week as opposed to per day. Goal ROI is computed by taking the target that the team wants the student to achieve as they are in either tier 2 or tier 3 interventions and subtract that goal by their beginning point. In other words, where they were at the beginning of tiered supports, say tier 1 intervention, and where you want them to be by the end of tiered supports. And then take that number and divide it by the number of days. Again, divided by the number of days, not instructional days or weeks or calendar weeks. Number of number of calendar days. The last metric is something that you absolutely do not want to do by hand. Instead, you want something like Excel or ChartDog, or likely your own product that you are using to benchmark student growth will calculate this for you. And that is the attained ROI. This is not for the faint of heart to calculate by hand because it requires computing what is referred to as an ordinary least squares regression. Not easy math. Make sure that you're using Excel, or your product typically already generates the attained ROI using ordinary least squares regression. Therefore, I'm not giving you the formula because I don't expect, nor do I really want anyone to do that by hand. If we then revisit Jane, you remember Jane, second grade, entering into second grade, problems in reading. She got tiered supports during winter and spring of first grade, and permission to evaluate was generated at the end of first grade. And then we have her benchmark and progress monitoring data provided here. Now, these benchmark data were not provided in the ER themselves, other than they are represented in the graphs, but the actual numbers are not provided in the ER because frankly, that would be data overload. But here are the data. When we then take and compute benchmark ROI, benchmark ROI should be computed on a seasonal basis, meaning half-year basis. And there are some references supporting that decision to avoid a year-long benchmark ROI computation and instead focus on a half-year benchmark ROI computation. So if we take the benchmark at the middle of the year was 36, and the benchmark at the end of the year is 51, and we subtract 51 minus 36, or we subtract 36 from 51 and divide by the number of calendar days, we get a daily words correct per minute. These are for oral reading fluency data. Words correct per minute of 0.12. But that's a daily rate, and many of us are less familiar with daily rates and are more familiar with weekly rates. Very easily converted by just simply taking your daily rate and multiplying it by 7, and you get a weekly rate of 0.84 words correct per minute per week. That is typical growth for first graders in the second half of the academic year. That's our rate of improvement for benchmark. Our goal ROI, recall, is the goal that the team establishes for Jane to help her close the achievement gap. And I put an asterisk next to that because the goal is subjectively identified by the team. And I would submit that many of our tools that we use for progress monitoring these days provide us with a reasonable way to project a robust, ambitious, yet still attainable rate of improvement for students. But nonetheless, we still have to come up with a goal. This team decided that they wanted to completely close the achievement gap for Jane. They wanted her to catch up to benchmark by the end of the academic year. So they established the goal for Jane by the end of the year to be 51 words correct per minute. She started out in the winter at 12. Therefore, we subtracted 12 from the goal of 51, divided by 125 days, and got this daily words correct per minute rate of improvement. But because we typically think of rates of improvement in the context of a weekly metric, then just simply multiply that by 7 to get a weekly metric of 2.184 words correct per minute. In other words, if Jane is to close the achievement gap, if she is going to come back to benchmark by the end of first grade, she needs to improve by a little over 2 words correct per minute per week. Ambitious, yes. Attainable? Some literature would say absolutely. Of course, just as a reminder, that setting of the goal was a team-based decision, and we want our goal to be ambitious, that they can catch up, but still attainable, still feasible. Calculating that last ROI, attained ROI, as I said, is not for us to be doing by hand because it requires ordinary least squares regression. And many authors, including Ted Christ and colleagues, have articulated very compellingly that we should have at least 12 data points for high stakes decisions, such as making eligibility decisions. Therefore, yes, if you're reading into this, this means a kid should be receiving a high quality, high fidelity intervention for at least 10 or 12 weeks. Although you can shorten that a little bit if you do bi-weekly progress monitoring and make instructional adjustments based upon those data. But you have to put a kid in tiered supports for a period of time in order for you to adequately and appropriately know whether or not they are responsive to that intervention. If your product does not compute an attained ROI, ChartDog or Excel, or the one that I just provided to Erica and she has subsequently posted on the shared Google Drive, can be quite helpful in calculating ROI. In Jane's case, her attained ROI during tier 3 supports, which started March 3rd, right here, and persisted through the end of the year, was 1.077 words correct per minute per week. A question in the chat that just came up when I'm talking about the number of days to compute ROI, to be crystal clear, we are advocating for using calendar days, not school days. Use calendar days. And there is a pretty lengthy discussion as to why calendar days are advised over school days in that paper, but in brief, it largely has to do with the frequent and sometimes modestly long disruptions in school days based upon various weather conditions, holidays, and other breaks, particularly in the middle of the year when we think about Thanksgiving break, winter breaks, and in some cases, schools have fairly lengthy spring breaks, which then would make it much more complicated to consider school days when comparing growth to national normative data. And so, yes, that would mean during winter and spring breaks, there would be less instructional days, which you should factor in when you're considering their growth rate. Again, Shannon and others who are asking, I'm sure Shannon's asking a question on behalf of some others who similarly had that question. That paper that Caitlin Benioff, Matt Furchuk, Annie McRae, and I wrote in School Psych Forum lays out the argument for that very reason in much more detail. Therefore, when we have computed our 3 ROIs and we compare them in the tabular representation of them provided at the bottom of your visual here, I have outlined in yellow, green, and blue benchmark ROI, goal ROI, and attained ROI during Tier 3 supports, respectively. Those numbers should correspond to what you saw on the previous slide. Notably, the two ROIs that are not outlined are ROIs that were computed for Tier 2, which is earlier in the RTI process for Jane. And then the last one actually is the ROI in aggregate across both Tier 1 and Tier 2 and Tier 3 support. So that is an ROI that is an arithmetic average of the ROI from just Tier 1 and then just Tier, let me start over again. This last ROI is the arithmetic average of the ROI from Tier 2 and the ROI from Tier 3. Sorry, I was misspeaking there numerous times. But we're going to focus on the ROI for benchmark, goal, and during Tier 3. When we do that, we want to compare the attained ROI to the benchmark ROI, and we want to compare the attained ROI to the goal ROI. I'm skipping over number 1 in the interest of time. I want to focus on 2 and 3. And notably, the criterion here for what is inadequate responsiveness must be established a priori by the local educational agency. Again, since we are a Commonwealth, you are never going to receive guidance from PDE, and the empirical literature is still lacking consensus with regard to how to compare and what are the thresholds specifically for what is considered inadequate responsiveness when we're comparing benchmark ROI to attained ROI and attained ROI to goal ROI. Now, we offer, that meaning Joe Kovaleski, Amanda Vander Hayden, and I are offering a suggestion, an opinion, however, that is ours and ours alone. What we recommend you do is you compare the discrepancy between attained ROI and goal ROI. Yes, we're advocating for a discrepancy analysis, but unlike the discrepancy analysis with which most of us have been familiar for many years, this discrepancy analysis does not consider IQ. Instead, it considers the difference between a student's attained ROI and the goal ROI that we had established for them. And it's done by simply using this formula. Divide the attained ROI by the goal ROI, and what you get is a proportion of the goal ROI that was actually attained or achieved. You're going to get a proportion. The proportion of what the student had to achieve in order to close the gap versus what they actually attained. And therefore, the LEA, or local educational agency, must, in advance of evaluating a particular kid, should establish a minimum or a threshold for inadequate responsiveness in terms of a proportion. I wish I could say that there is empirical literature that tells you this should be your criterion, but regrettably, no such literature exists. We are working on it, but it is not there yet. What we are cautiously recommending schools use is, for example, something like 75% of the attained ROI compared to the goal ROI would represent responsiveness, adequate responsiveness. Anything below 75% of goal ROI is indicative of inadequate responsiveness. A school could also, or a district could also elect to use a 50% cutoff of goal ROI compared to attained ROI as its threshold. And as we will see here in a little bit, the Jane evaluation, the school district selected its own criterion for what is adequate or inadequate responsiveness to intervention. And little preview, the school established a 75% threshold of goal ROI and attained ROI compared to each other. But that was something that the school established. And Amanda Vander Hayden, Joe Kovaleski, and I know that there is no empirical evidence to support that as being the absolute criterion, but we believe it is a reasonable criterion that a school could use. And if you're wondering, well, gee, how can you be advocating for something that has no empirical basis? Let's not forget that ability achievement discrepancy approaches, and frankly, pattern of strengths and weaknesses, likewise have limited, if any, empirical evidence behind them as well. So the fields need to continue emerging, and we are currently working on that in earnest. Okay, so that is the first method of establishing RTI, responsiveness to intervention. The second method is student growth percentiles. Student growth percentiles, for those who maybe are not familiar, are based on an understanding that student growth is not uniform or consistent across all students. In fact, what we know from about a decade or so of work, if not a little bit longer, is that kids who are high performers and kids who are low performers actually have markedly different rates of improvement or responsiveness over time compared to kids who are in the middle. Consequently, the initial starting point of a student greatly influences their growth over time. If I am an average reader, I am likely, despite everything else, I am likely to grow at a faster rate than a kid who is a really, really strong reader, as well as a kid who is a very, very weak reader. SGPs, student growth percentiles, are calculated based upon those thrice annual assessments and give us a normative comparison of growth for a particular student when they are compared to, and this is important, an academic peer, meaning their growth is being compared to a bunch of other kids who started out at about the same point as them. And the reason we compare their growth to academic peers is because we know, again, that growth is not consistent for all students. SGPs are reported as a percentile rank typically, although some vendors give you some seemingly randomly generated number, but fundamentally those numbers are all nested within a percentile rank normative kind of comparison. The percentile rank is interpreted just like any other percentile rank. It means the proportion of academic peers that this student grew better than or equal to out of 99 other academic peers. For example, an SGP of 50 means that this particular student grew at a rate that was equal to or better than 50% of academic peers. Notably, it's not 50% of all peers, it's 50% of peers who, generally speaking, started out at the same point as this particular student. Here is an illustration of SGPs outside of the Jane illustration that we have been using thus far in today's webinar. This is Elena, who is in 3rd grade. Benchmark ROI for 3rd grade on oral reading fluency is indicated by the green line and the green triangles. Elena started out here at the beginning of the year, and this this purple dashed line represents an SGP of 10. That means Elena's growth, if she were along this line, were equivalent to about 10% of kids who started out at the same level as her at the beginning of the year. The brown longer dashed line represents an SGP of 50, so that is average growth for someone who started out at about the same level as Elena. The blue, dark blue dashed and dotted line represents an SGP of 80, meaning growth along this line is indicative of Elena growing equal to or better than 80 out of 99 kids who were her academic peers at the beginning of the year. And then the most robust SGP is indicated by the red dotted line, indicative of a 95th percentile rank of growth, meaning if Elena's performance was around this red line, her growth would be equal to or better than 95% of all of her academic peers. That is incredibly robust growth. This is just, again, a simple illustration of SGPs for those who maybe are less familiar with SGPs. Fundamentally, an SGP is a percentile rank comparison of growth compared to academic peers, those who started out at the same point. Depending upon your vendor, they will give you SGPs in different ways. For example, Acadience and Dibbles oftentimes use pathways of progress, and they have verbiage that correlates to very low growth or low SGP, sub-average SGP, more average SGP, above average SGP, and then extremely robust SGP, indicated by well above typical, and so forth. So Acadience and Dibbles tend to use those terms in place of an SGP numerical value. STAR uses some numbers as well as some language that is indicative of interpretive guidance around SGPs. They're all built around the same logic, but the actual number or how they are described will vary from one vendor to the next. SGPs do have their advantages. They are abundantly helpful in projecting student growth based upon academic peers. Super helpful. And in particular, we advocate for using SGPs to help guide teams in making decisions about what's an ambitious yet feasible goal by the end of tiered supports. It's a way to create an ambitious yet still practical goal by the end of the year. Historically, we were just making up our target or our goal for the end of period of intervention. Now we can use SGPs to guide us to a more appropriate, achievable, ambitious goal. Another advantage of SGPs is they're a wonderful way of operationalizing growth for non-technicians, for people who don't necessarily understand or want to understand the mathematics behind growth. So SGPs are very, very accessible by consumers, especially parents and teachers and administrators. SGPs, however, do have some disadvantages. One of those disadvantages actually centers around the unknown psychometric properties of the distribution of SGPs along a normal curve. We do not necessarily know that growth for academic peers is normally distributed, and therefore we don't know precisely that a 50th percentile rank is necessarily solidly average for every academic peer, whether it's low, a little bit below average, average above average, or extremely high. We just don't know the distribution of growth for academic peers. Therefore, SGPs are concerning from the perspective of using them for high stakes decision making. And as a result of this lack of technical properties that we feel is required to make a high stakes decision, we believe that SGPs are informative to an extent. They give us good information that help us to establish a goal for closing the achievement gap within a reasonable period of time. And in fact, some products increasingly now we see have a catch-up feature that helps teams establish an ambitious and realistic goal. And we feel as though SGPs are very, very helpful in that regard. But what we worry about is that given the lack of sufficient information about the psychometric properties of an SGP, we, Amanda Vander Hayden, Joe Kowaleski, myself, and many others, are suggesting that you do not use SGPs exclusively for establishing whether or not a student has demonstrated adequate or inadequate responsiveness to intervention. What that means is if you have a product that calculates an SGP, use it for establishing goals, use it to get a general understanding of how well a student has improved over time. But when it comes to the high stakes decision of does this kid have a disability or not, we would implore you to default back to calculating rates of improvement for benchmark, goal, and attained ROIs. In other words, we would strongly encourage that school teams not use SGPs for eligibility decision-making, use them for all other decisions that are made up until that point. But when you get to the point of making a decision about does the kid have an SLD, we strongly recommend that you calculate and compare benchmark, goal, and attained ROIs instead. And if your product does not do that for you, most products have a feature where you can data dump into an Excel spreadsheet, the progress monitoring data, plug those data into the Excel spreadsheet or that I provided during the break, or use something like ChartDog to facilitate computation of those benchmark, goal, and attained ROIs, and use those data for making eligibility decisions. A very, very good question in the chat. Doesn't doing this then make the determination of adequate responsiveness based on how ambitious an LEA sets its goal? And absolutely, it does. Thank you, Caitlin, for that question. It's a very legitimate question, because if a team establishes a very easy goal to achieve, then a kid could look like they're responding to intervention. But the challenge is that they're not closing the gap. And therefore, what is important is for the team, the school teams that are working with and setting goals for kids throughout their tiered supports, are establishing goals that help close the gap. And so that typically means that they're either reaching benchmark by the end of the intervention period, or at least they're achieving a performance level that gets them out of risk categories. Because if we don't do that, then we're never going to get a kid out of risk. And to this point, we're going to have inadequate or adequate responsiveness metrics that are misleading. And they're misleading because the goal was too low to begin with. And therefore, Caitlin's comment, which is spot on, very insightful, makes us be mindful of the goals that teams establish, especially as a kid is in tier 3 supports. Because recall, tier 3 is going to be kind of the last ditch effort before we make a move toward considering special education for a student. And I would suggest that in tier 3, we should be establishing goals of performance that by the end of tier 3, kids are out of risk. I'm not saying they have to be average, but they at least should be out of risk. And remember, way back a number of slides, way before our break, I noted that products establish their level of risk, sometimes around the 25th or 30th percentile rank. I think that's pretty high. Instead, I would suggest that maybe getting a student back into the mid-teens percentile rank would mean we're getting them out of the woods. We maybe aren't completely closing the achievement gap, but they're making progress. That is an important thing. And remember, using RTI logic for establishing an SLD, one of the fundamental assumptions is that if a kid truly has an SLD, they are not making gains even when we throw really, really highly efficacious interventions at them. And so we should be seeing some gains if this kid does not have an SLD. If the kid does have an SLD, then we should be seeing flatlining of growth despite implementing with integrity high quality interventions. Therefore, to summarize my response to Caitlin's comment, which is an excellent one, that is exactly why school teams, when working with kids at tier 3, need to be establishing ambitious goals that at least get them to the lower end of average range by the end of an extended intervention period. Otherwise, our very easy goal can be misleading when calculating responsiveness to intervention, excuse me. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Feel free to type in the chat any questions that may have come up as a result of that. Otherwise, we're going to move on to mastery measurement. Mastery measurement is the last operationalization of RTI. And again, this is going to be unique to certain products, namely Spring Math, because Spring Math uses a mastery measurement approach. If you're not interested in Spring Math, or you are not using a system that uses mastery measurement approaches, then this is an opportunity for you to learn a little bit about it, but I wouldn't get too bogged down into the weeds if this is less familiar to you, because again, it is specific to products. In a mastery measurement approach, intervention is provided to all students so they can master essential skills that predict academic success. And what is actually being measured are two things: One thing that is being measured is the generalizable, what we used to refer to as the general outcome measure, or GOM, going way back, harkening back to 20 or 30 years ago literature. That is the distal goal, the thing that we want them to achieve long-term, such as oral reading fluency or math computational skills. Concurrently, within a mastery measurement model, we are also measuring something called trials to criterion. Trials to criterion is the amount of time it takes a student to learn a discrete skill, a very, very specific skill. Within a mastery measurement model, we are measuring both long-term progress on a general outcome measure, such as oral reading fluency and math computation, while we are also measuring on, frankly, a daily basis, if not a weekly basis, how long it takes students to learn specific or discrete skills. Let's take, for example, Elena, who is in 3rd grade. So we're deviating from the ER that was provided, largely because the school district in which the ER was generated did not use mastery measurement approaches. So this was not even an option for the school to consider when evaluating Jane. We have Elena, who's in 3rd grade. Her oral reading fluency at winter was 30 words correct per minute. Spring benchmark was 100. And therefore, if we wanted to completely close the achievement gap, we would establish an end of 3rd grade goal of 100 words correct per minute, but that's pretty ambitious considering she's at 30 in the middle of the year. So maybe the team would establish a goal that's somewhere between 30 and 100, but hopefully a lot closer to 100 than it would be closer to 30. Back to Caitlin's comment just a few moments ago. And what the school then is measuring for Elena is her progress toward oral reading fluency performance by the end of the year, and then also how long it takes her to gain specific skills. And the way that is done is by progress monitoring oral reading fluency weekly, and then the trials to criterion. That is her rate of acquiring specific skills. Now, here is a graph that is going to be a little bit overwhelming at first, but if I'm doing my job at least modestly well, you'll have a better understanding after a few moments of explanation. A time series graph with data represented chronologically along the x-axis, and along the y-axis, we have words and sounds read correctly per minute. This is a graph that represents phase changes. Now, the phases here do not correspond to differences of instructional approaches per se. Instead, the phase changes represent skills that were specifically taught during instruction. So the very first phase represented here, the instructional diet was focused exclusively on teaching a particular phoneme pattern. And we just generically called it phoneme pattern number 1. And then after a period of time, phoneme pattern number 2 was the focus of instruction. And again, we stuck with generic representations of different phoneme patterns, thus to avoid the debate about is that the correct pattern of phonemes to sequence in terms of first, then second, and then maybe 3rd or 4th patterns being taught. Then during the 3rd phase of instruction, the focus of instruction was on reading continuous text. To summarize, first instructional target was on a particular phoneme pattern. Once that was mastered, then a second phoneme pattern was the focus of instruction. And then after that was mastered, the focus of instruction was on reading continuous text. These are 3 different phases, again, focused on instructional targets, not how kids are being taught. The solid black line that is highest or most elevated represents our benchmark performance across time. So this is typical oral reading fluency growth. Oral reading fluency growth of students who experience little to no challenge, instructionally speaking. Now, what we have here are a bunch of other lines that I need to explain. The smaller dashed line represents Elena's goal ROI on oral reading fluency. She started out at the beginning of the year on oral reading fluency down here, and this line represents her goal ROI. The team said that by the midpoint of the academic year, we want Elena to have closed the achievement gap on oral reading fluency. That's her goal ROI. The longer dashed line represents Jane's attained ROI. This is what she actually achieved. And I hope you will notice that Elena actually grew at a faster rate than she needed to in order to close the achievement gap. This is a success story. Elena grew at a much faster rate. These are the distal skills, the general outcome measures, the overall oral reading fluency with which all of us are familiar when we think of progress monitoring and charting growth over time. The new feature for mastery measurement, however, is illustrated by these lighter shaded lines. These lighter shaded lines represent trials to criterion. That's the new feature that mastery measurement provides for us. Trials to criterion are measures of weekly performance on a specific skill. In other words, how did Elena do on phoneme patterns? That is represented by this lighter shade line here. And this particular instructional regimen aspired to the students achieving 60 sounds, letter sounds read correctly in 1 minute. That is represented by this gray line. The goal again was to achieve 60 letter sound correspondences per minute at the end of this instructional target. As you can see, Elena at the beginning was not at that goal. Halfway or 3/4 of the way through the intervention period, she got a little bit better. And then thankfully, by the 4th week, she had achieved that criterion on the mastery target of decoding skills, specifically phoneme pattern decoding. Then, once she achieved that criterion, the instruction switched from one phoneme pattern to another phoneme pattern. And that phoneme pattern was taught over a series of weeks. An assessment on a weekly basis was conducted until Elena achieved the criterion at the 4th week of this second targeted instructional period of achieving at least a 60 sounds read correctly in a minute. At which point in time, the instructional focus switched from that second phoneme pattern over to reading continuous text. And as you can see, in this case, now we're talking words read correctly. Her growth markedly improved over the course of those first 5 to 7 weeks of instruction that was focused on continuous text. In sum, this graph, which has a lot of information, graphically displays typical growth on the general outcome measure, in this case, oral reading fluency, Elena's goal for closing the gap on oral reading fluency, her attained oral reading fluency rate of improvement, and concurrently plots on this graph how long it took her to learn specific or discrete skills. The reason for this plotting of discrete skills is because, again, if you think about what a specific learning disability is from a theoretical perspective, it means that an individual cannot learn specific skills despite our best efforts. And the only way to measure specific skills is by doing something referred to mastery measurement and assessing trials to criterion. In other words, how long it takes an individual to learn discrete skills. Now, if your head is spinning around all of this, it is likely because you are not familiar with Spring Math or any other, and I think Spring Math, frankly, is the only one to which I am aware that uses mastery measurement approaches outside of going back into the 1970s and 80s literature when we, with regard to students with learning disabilities, and the work by Dino and Merkin and others that looked at, how fast or how rapidly do students with disabilities learn specific or discrete skills. Frankly, this mastery measurement approach, I believe, is going to be the future of assessing growth over time, but it is used very sparingly in our products that we have at our disposal at this point in time. And in particular, it is specific to something like Spring Math. If you're not using Spring Math, then this is relatively foreign to you, but hopefully this is a little bit of a preview to what is likely to come as more products become aware of this as another way of measuring acute growth on specific skills, as well as long-term growth on distal kind of general outcome measures such as oral reading fluency and math computation. If you're using mastery measurement, then how do you then establish what is adequate or inadequate responsiveness? And I'm going to jump down to the inadequate responsiveness is typically illustrated by a student who takes a long time to achieve criterion on discrete skills. In other words, they have very slow acquisition, and concurrently they have very poor growth toward that distal goal of or reading fluency or math computation. That, in our humble opinion, is a student who would be indicative of inadequate responsiveness. They're not learning discrete skills very quickly, and they're also not gaining on that more distal goal as well. They're relatively flatline on short-term and long-term goals. If, however, you have a student who has very low trials to criterion, meaning they have rapid acquisition of basic or discrete skills, and their attained ROI is robust, that means they're closing the gap and they're learning discrete skills quickly. That's a student who, in our opinion, demonstrates adequate responsiveness. If you have a student who has low trials to criterion, meaning they have rapid acquisition of discrete skills, and their attained ROI is poor, then that's a kid who demonstrates the ability to acquire discrete skills, but for whatever reason, they're not generalizing or maintaining those skills long-term. And that's not necessarily a kid with a learning disability. That's a kid who struggles with generalization. And we have instructional approaches that can be quite helpful in helping kids generalize and maintain those skills in other areas or over longer periods of time. That's not a kid with a learning disability. That's a kid who's struggling with generalization, which is a different beast that we can tackle using different approaches. Fundamentally, we view as though a student who has high trials to criterion and very poor growth, as demonstrated by both indicators of within mastery and measurement, is a kid who is demonstrating inadequate responsiveness. So what I'd like you to do is stamp again. After this direct instruction, some of which hopefully was good, I hope all of it was, but you be the judge. What is your understanding of rate of improvement, student growth percentiles, and mastery measurement? Are you pretty good? Are you so-so? Are you still, I'm not quite sure. And honesty is appreciated. As an instructor, I take this feedback and use it to better the next time I describe these three conceptualizations of RTI. Okay. It looks like the majority of folks are quite good with ROI and SG. Oops, and I apologize for the acronym being wrong here on this slide. It should be SGP, not SPG. Sorry about that. And I know we had a fair number of huhs for mastery measurement, and now it looks like at least people have shifted toward the so-so, which I can live with so-so on mastery measurement because it's pretty complex. And if you're not familiar with or have no exposure to Spring Math, then it is completely new to you. All right, a friendly reminder to stop annotating, and we will move on. Okay, all right. How are we therefore doing overall in terms of evaluating responsiveness to intervention? Are you all right, all right, all right? Are you slow down and you got questions, or are you saying my head hurts? I can't wait for this session to be over. And again, my appreciation for those who are unable to stamp for any number of reasons, whether it's a skill deficit or performance deficit, doesn't matter to me. I appreciate the fact that you're putting in the chat your response. We got greens, goods, okay. So we're looking good, fantastic. Again, a reminder to stop stamping if you have been doing the stamping. All right. Okay, so now how do we integrate this into an ER? What I want you to do is go back into the ER document itself. If you have a printed version of it that you can flip to pages 7, 9, and 10. If you have a virtual version of it or a digital version, then you can look at it on your screen. Or If you have none of those, I've got it here provided for you on the PowerPoint. On page 7, you will see nonsense word fluency, correct letter sounds plotted on a time series graph. Notice that at the top of the graph, we have indicated with a modest degree of specificity the interventions that were installed during the various phases. I do not want to get into a debate as to whether these were the most appropriate or most efficacious interventions. That is for a conversation in another workshop. For today, please just humor me and say these are the best interventions that were available in the school. Notice that we have also indicated the extent to which they are tier 1, tier 1.5, which is a new thing for some of you. Tier 1.5 is essentially class-wide intervention on top of what we're already doing for all kids. Tier 2 and then tier 3. By the way, I mentioned tier 1.5. Your head is probably exploding if you're thinking we've now come out with triangles or pyramids that have 4 levels as opposed to 3. And yes, in fact, we do. We can talk about that at another point in time. Didn't mean to make your head explode, but we are advocating for improving the quality of tier 1 interventions before you actually consider tiered supports for selected kids. But anyhow, so there we have the various interventions, and of course the data are plotted on the graph. Then you can also see on page 9 in a numerical representation the weekly ROIs as they were calculated. Again, the first one, 0.84, is benchmark ROI. That's the yellow line from winter. Now, mind you, this is from winter to spring. So in terms of the time series graph, it would be from the middle point of the year to the ending of the year. So 43 to 58. Notice that this particular project benchmark performance is at the 31st and 36th percentile rank, respectively, at the middle and the end of the year. So this product, for whatever reason, has established that as its percentile rank minimum of risk, or maximum, excuse me, of risk. Then in terms of the winter to spring goal ROI, that's the green line represented on the time series graph. That was a 1.46 weekly ROI. That's what Jane had to achieve in order to close the gap by the end of the academic year. And then her tier 2 ROI, that was from, let's say, middle of January through the middle of February. That's this blue line. And then her tier 3 ROI is the last blue line from basically the end of February through the end of the academic year. Were computed to be 0.31 and 0.26 respectively. And then while a crude metric, one that you probably don't want to be interpreting because it is muddied by the fact that that Jane was in 2 different types of interventions, we have an ROI for the entire second half of the academic year, as represented here by 0.23. So that is where we indicate in the ER her ROIs. Then on page 10, we have the same thing repeated, but this time for oral reading fluency. And again, for oral reading fluency in first grade, those data commence data collection in the middle of the year, which is why you do not see oral reading fluency data for the first half of the year. It just was not administered. It's not appropriate at the beginning of first grade. And then again, the weekly ROIs for oral reading fluency across benchmark, goal, tier 1, tier 2 and tier 3 for Jane, and then a cumulative ROI across both tiers 2 and 3. And as we have already noted, the ER document has this lovely determination of SLD worksheet, which is the latter third of the evaluation report template. And therefore, if you turn to page 20 in your paper or digital version, you will see the statement of the LEA's decision rule for insufficient progress at the top of page 20. And also an emphasis on documenting the fidelity with which those scientifically research-based interventions were installed also appears on page 20, with a summary of ROI data on pages 21 and 22 of that determination worksheet. Here they are excerpted for those who don't want to or are unable to flip through paper or digital versions of the ER. Here they are on page 20. Notice that we have a nice table here that lists the interventions at tier 1, tier 1.5, tiers 2 and 3. The intensity is documented as well as the grouping. And then the fidelity indicated as being confirmed or not confirmed, with more detailed evidence of fidelity in the narrative, but this is a summary provided in tabular format. That is for the actual interventions themselves on page 20, and then the ROI data, frankly, as well as some of our benchmarking and progress monitoring data, are provided on page 21. That was for nonsense word fluency. Then on page 22, we have the data for oral reading fluency, again, indicative of those weekly growth rates for benchmark, ROI, goal ROI, and then Jane's attained ROI through tier 2, through tier 3, and then an aggregate across tiers 2 and 3. Notice that on page 22, there is a reference in the conclusion. Now, here's where you have to read a little bit of the narrative. We have computed the proportion of the attained ROI during tier 2 that was achieved relative to the goal. During tier 2, on nonsense word fluency, Jane's attained ROI was less than 1/4 of her goal ROI that was necessary. And during tier 3, her attained ROI was less than 18% of her goal ROI. So what we did there was we took, during tier 3 on nonsense word fluency, her attained ROI on nonsense word fluency, which was 0.26, and divided it by the goal ROI for nonsense word fluency in order for her to close the gap. That difference, comes out to 17.8%. Then when we look at her aggregate attained ROI across both tiers of intervention compared to her goal ROI, we get a proportion of 15.8%. When we repeat that same math for oral reading fluency, we get a proportional gain during tier 2 of 31.6 of her goal ROI. So less than 1/3 of her goal ROI was actually attained during tier 2 supports. During tier 3 supports, the proportion of her attained ROI relative to her goal ROI improved, but it was improved only to just under 50% of her goal ROI. And across the 2 tiers of support, so tier 3 and tier 2 in aggregate, her attained ROI was just south of 1/3 of what it needed to be for her to achieve the goal at the end of the year. And remember, her goal was an ambitious goal. It was a goal to close the achievement gap. In sum, when we look at Jane's attained ROI relative to her goal ROI and compare that to the school district's established requirement for responsiveness or lack of responsiveness to intervention, which was established at 75%. In other words, the district said that in order for a student to be categorized as being responsive to intervention, their attained ROI must be at least 75% of the goal ROI. If it's below 75% of their goal ROI, then that is indicative of a lack of responsiveness or inadequate responsiveness to intervention. And using that as the district's criterion, and then reflecting across all of the different proportionate gains of attained ROI relative to goal ROI, it is clear that Jane's attained ROI is demonstrative of inadequate responsiveness relative to the district's threshold of a minimum of 75%. And therefore, that is how we would quantify in an objective manner whether or not a student has achieved responsiveness to instruction or has not achieved responsiveness to intervention. All right, that was a lot, quite a lot, and we're approaching the end of our session, and I'm only 2/3 the way through the PowerPoint. But this is the meat of what I wanted to review. So how are we doing? Are we all right, all right, all right? Do we need to slow down? You have some questions? Or are you thinking that your head really hurts and you're just cannot wait for the end of this session? So please stamp. All right, we're seeing some indications in the chat that folks are saying they're green as well. Good, good, good. Okay, and so if you wouldn't mind stopping your stamping, and in our remaining few minutes, because again, we wanted to end just a couple of minutes early to the benefit of many of our colleagues who have other meetings to attend to shortly, I wanted to just draw your attention to a few other pieces of the evaluation report. And that is in regard to systematic comprehensive classroom observations and rule outs. And I am going to jump ahead in the PowerPoint. So let me find where I want to be. And okay. So in terms of the systematic classroom observations, IDEA requires systematic evaluation of students, systematic observation of students while they are in their instructional setting. There is no requirement for anything more than doing an observation. We believe, however, that multiple observations are necessary, in part because those observations should be used to inform instructional practice. They should be used as a student is moving through the tiers of support. Notably, some of those observations might be strictly for evaluating fidelity of intervention implementation, but they also could be brief observations that are done to appraise the quality of instruction and the interaction between the student and their peers and the student and the teacher. And so what you will see in this evaluation report in a summative manner on pages 23, and then in more detail earlier on pages 2 through 5, are summaries of some classroom observations that were done. And I guess I didn't put any I forgot to indicate in the PowerPoint some of that detail from the ER, but let me just jump ahead to page 22, 23. We have teacher reports and parent reports, which of course are very important to include in there. But then we should have some other observational data, notably, I gotta find my place. Sorry, folks, that I lost it here briefly. Page 23. Go back up to page 23. Oh yeah, here it is. So this is a summary of data that were provided in much greater detail on pages 2 through 5 using some coding systems that I hope at least one of them is somewhat familiar to folks out there. That is the BOSS, the behavior observation of students in schools, which is far more familiar to school psychs than maybe the SECOS, which is the state event classroom observation system. Both of those are coding structures. There are other coding structures that are also available, such as direct behavior rating scales, DBRs, as well as a few others, class maps, which can be helpful in terms of gauging the interaction of the student within their instructional environment. And so we need to make sure that we're doing that because A, it's required in IDEA, it's also a required element of our evaluation reports, but I think most importantly, those data can be and ought to be useful as a student is moving through tiered supports so that we can adjust our instruction to better produce outcomes that are favorable for the student. And then the last thing I wanted to draw your attention to in very brief are those rule outs. Remember that the third and fourth criteria for SLD determination requires us to rule out that the kid, for example, does not have an emotional disturbance or intellectual disability, that cultural and linguistic factors are not the primary cause of their skill deficits in school. And so we have some locations within the evaluation report in which we believe ample evidence is provided to rule out lack of instruction, to rule out inadequate assessment of progress over time, as well as some of those other rule outs related to cultural, linguistic, and intellectual factors. So I realized that I very briefly mentioned those last 2 of the 4 criteria for SLD determination, but I predicted that was going to happen when at the outset I said, don't forget those last 2 criteria. We're only going to talk about them for about 5 minutes. And true to form, we only spent a few moments talking about them. That is not to de-emphasize their importance, however. Okay, by my watch, it is 11:34, which leaves us a few additional minutes for questions and comments. My hope was to focus heavily on operationalization of level, which is the first criterion. The second criterion, which is responsiveness to intervention, remind us of those rule outs and requirements for observations. And here's the point at which I field any additional questions that people may have, whether it's in the chat or I'm not sure, Erica, if folks can unmute or not.
I will go ahead and pause the recording so then people should be able to do whatever they are comfortable with. So give me 1 second.